Maybe where Gramsci was speaking of cultural Marxism much more broadly, Lukács was speaking in very specific detail of how to overthrow the existing paradigms in the West. And part of his theory was this, again, like Gramsci, he was a guy who understood that the conventional Marxist means of overthrowing existing governments and overtaking a society, that is to say, a frontal assault with guns, with a revolution, with a coup d'etat. He said, look, the structure of the West is far too strong. The pillars of Western society are far too strong. The average person respects their government. The average person isn't seething with resentment and wanting to overthrow the government. They have complaints. But it's not the same thing as fomenting with deep resentment and a desire to destroy the existing paradigms, to destroy the government. And he understood, as Karl Marx understood, and as Gramsci understood. Gramsci was an Italian political theorist. He was imprisoned by Mussolini. He wrote these secret notebooks in the 1930s that became the object of worship among Marxists in the West. Well, Lukács, the Hungarian, he said we have to destroy Christianity first, because everything else you're attacking is really just is part of the outflow of what Christianity is. Now, there would be some of you who are listening to this and going, well, I'm not a Christian. What do you mean Christianity is the foundation of Western society? If you were born and raised in the West, particularly if you were above, let's say, the age of 30, all the more so, let's say, if you're above the age of 50, you have likely, unless you were in some odd little Berkeley-esque, bubble, you likely inhaled deeply of a Judeo-Christian worldview, and it formed the basis of your worldview. Somewhere deep inside of you, you probably believe, even if you're an atheist, that you're not prepared to equate human life with animal life. I mean, if you're an atheist and you're going to follow your atheism to its logical conclusions, that is a logical conclusion of atheism, that human beings have no more value than any other animal on the planet. These guys were saying, look, even among unbelievers in Western society, most of them, the structure of their thinking, of their moral outlook is Judeo-Christian in nature. This book right here, little book I got right here, The Suicide of the West, the authors of this talk about this. I don't know that either one of them are Christians. They may be, but this is a point that they're making in this book. And by the way, this is a point that was also made, this book right down here, Civilization, the West and the Rest by Neil Ferguson, Harvard historian, Oxford PhD. Neil Ferguson argues that as Christianity is declining in the West, what you're seeing is the rise of barbarism. And that's because the Christian faith has served as a bulwark for centuries against some of the barbarism, much of the barbarism that has engulfed much of the world, that has brought about genocides, that has brought about totalitarian regimes that seem endless, that's brought about banana republics. The United States has, by and large, avoided this, not completely, and has also been able to move past its own mistakes, like slavery. It can deal with national sins like slavery through the Christian faith, which says there can be forgiveness and restoration. Georg Lukács, he said, look, we have to destroy the West, particularly America's Christian foundations. And he decided, and here's where the rubber meets the road, maybe that's not the best choice of words, but he decided that the way was through sex education. It's through sex education. Get that into schools. Because under the cover, the cloak of sex education, you could convince parents that what children are being taught is responsible sexual activity, how to not get diseases. He was trying to implement this in Hungary, but wasn't successful because the regime itself didn't last. So what did he do? He joined the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School in Germany, many of you by now will have heard of it. Maybe you hadn't heard of it 5 years ago, but you probably have now. The Frankfurt School, which is made up of Marxists who are hell-bent on the destruction of the West. The Frankfurt School, most of the members of the Frankfurt School fled Germany when Hitler gained power in 1933. Where did they go? They went to the United States. They went to New York. Began having massive influence in the United States on academics in the United States, particularly at Columbia University. And they absorbed a lot of Lukács's ideas regarding sex education. Get that in the classroom, and it's like getting a crowbar beneath Christianity and thus beneath Western civilization as a whole, and you can begin busting it up. I like what British writer Rob Slane says about this. This is terrific. So here's what sex education really is. It is not an attempt to educate children about sexual intercourse or to encourage sexual responsibility or to prevent teenage pregnancies. Rather, it is an attempt by the state to sever the link between marriage and procreation, to sever the link between parents and their children, and above all, to destroy traditional Christian sexual ethics and the family for good. It is above all about the destruction of traditional Christian sexual ethics and the family for good. That is the goal of sexual education in the West. That is the goal of Marxists, in order to bust up Western society, because then you begin to break up Western morality. And once Christianity goes, said T.S. Lewis, the whole culture goes. Neil Ferguson quotes in Civilization, the West and the Rest, talking about the West. He has a conversation with an anonymous Chinese academic, anonymous for obvious reasons. And this Chinese academic said, "We have studied your culture for decades, and we've only now finally come to understand the source of its strength. It is the Christian faith." That's why they've targeted it. Did you know that TikTok is banned in China? All the crap that is being pipelined into your child's head on that app, the Chinese themselves do not allow in China. They also regulate how long they can actually be on social media, try to give them educational things and so on. China's not a great country, but they recognize that what they're doing is trying to, I'm banned in China, by the way, but they recognize that what they're doing in feeding nonsense through social media, TikTok in particular, to the West and to Western children, is they realize that they're undermining our society as a whole. They're weakening us because they recognize that the Christian faith is the source of our strength, and anything they can do to assault that, they're going to do. So what you're seeing at the White House and in schools and in entertainment, in all of it, is an attempt to destroy existing moral, social, and political paradigms. And this isn't, by the way, really ultimately about sex. It is about power. I love the way Will Durant put it in his 11-volume work on the history of civilization. He's a historian from a generation ago, a couple of generations now, I guess. He said this in talking about the fall of Greece and the fall of Athens. He said, when the Athenians no longer wanted to give to society, but for society to give to them, when the freedom they longed for was the freedom from responsibility, Athens ceased to be free. Athens ceased to be free. That's the direction we're headed in, because we no longer see freedom as having any guardrails on it. We no longer see it as requiring individual responsibility. We're trying to tell, all women, they have no responsibility for their actions, no responsibility for your choices. Black people, no responsibility for your actions, no responsibility for your choices. And hence the cultural Marxists understood the way to sneak into Western society, our ideology, is under the guise, the lie of freedom and privacy. And thus we can